This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, gets today's show rolling with his grain market outlook. He breaks down where the markets are moving and what is contributing to it. K-State Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff continues the show as he discusses lice on cattle and why they are more of an issue in the winter. The show wraps up with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with his weather forecast. Chip comments on recent rain, but how increased fire concern is beginning. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with the grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, what are we seeing for futures?
Well, we're in a mode where we'd seen futures come up, rise higher across the corn and soybean futures especially, and even a bit on wheat over the past 1 or 2 weeks. And now we seem, for the last several days, to have topped out. And a number of factors involved in that we'll talk about today. Weather issues down South America, the threat, and then hopes that trade tariffs changes will or will not impact the markets, and also ongoing challenges in understanding the local cash situation. Again, we had talked about last week, I think, the on parts of Kansas, although the futures have gone higher, that we still have pretty weak basis, and that there apparently had been quite a bit of sales of grain earlier on, and at least at this point, users still full up with supplies until sometime out into spring and May. In fact, you go back and look at the last grain stocks report for corn in Kansas. I think 22 or 23% of the grain was still on farm. Everything else is in commercial hands. So it would make sense, given those numbers, how that situation could come about. So we've been looking at that, and I don't see on the futures markets at this time any surprising carries that we haven't been seeing. However, you do see from the March corn contract that closed at $4.90 and a quarter yesterday, and from up to May at 501.5, you see that's about 5.5 or 5 3/5 cents a bushel, and that's not too bad. But then that carry falls off to about 1 cent a bushel per month from May into July. For soybeans, you still have for the March to the May contract and May to the July contract, over 7 cents a bushel per month carry. So I don't know how many farmers are still going to be holding those crops long term, but those that are, you've got some carry there, and maybe something worth considering in terms of a storage hedge of some type. And for wheat, you do see a close. We saw a close on Thursday of 588 and a quarter on the March contract. May at 598 and a quarter. In July above $6 up to 607. And you see carries of 5 to 4 3/5 to 6 cents a bushel a month, and those carries extend all the way out to December. So we have some issues happening in the world markets. We've been talking about South America for the most part with regard to corn and soybean impacts, but there are concerns in other parts of the world that are affecting the wheat markets as well. I would say that in the last few days, if any of these commodities has moved to the higher side since we spoke last a week ago, it's probably been wheat. And in a way, wheat's been struggling so much that's been it's kind of a surprise. Some of that comes back to really a strong week of exports. So I guess if prices on a commodity like wheat in the U.S. move low enough, it'll attract buyers. And it did. You can see that in the hard red winter wheat export numbers, as well as especially the hard red numbers and hard red winter numbers. And so that's a welcome sight for Kansas wheat growers to see the commodity start to move in the area.
What are we seeing for cash prices?
Some surprising things. When look first at the ethanol markets. Ever since we've been talking about grain market, Shelby, on this program, we've said, well, gosh, it seems like Kansas is always has the strongest price for corn going into ethanol plants. And that other than 1 week, I think that I've talked about this, we'd seen that occur. Well, now you've got a situation where in the Eastern Corn Belt, you actually have stronger prices in Ohio than you have in Kansas. Average price, well, price range of 487 to 504. In Kansas, 479 to 502. So top end price is a little bit higher. Average price 493 in Kansas, 496, 497 in Ohio. You look at the weather maps, it's dry in Ohio. So I don't know if that's necessarily the issue that's driving that. Of course, it's an ethanol driven bid, so we'd have to look probably closer at the ethanol prices back in that part of the country as well. But I don't know if correlation makes for causality, but there are parts of the Eastern Corn Belt that are just pretty dry, and that probably could play into the psychology of the bids that are occurring. Would also say here in Kansas, we've watched for a long time the corn basis in Southwest Kansas as the bellwether of the state, and that it continues to weaken. The cash price of 505, which isn't necessarily bad, but that's only a 15 over basis, and we've been seeing 20 in recent weeks, 40, 45, 50 in most of the time the last few years. In the driest of years, 2-3 years ago, we saw $1 plus $1.60, et cetera. So now we're down to about 15 over, and that's a change, and either due to this issue of everybody being full up on the one hand, or the affordability of wheat as a competitor in livestock feed rations. And you still have a ratio of wheat prices to cash wheat price to cash corn price. They're in Garden City with the cash wheat at 518, corn at 508. So you have wheat only 3% over that of corn for the cash price in that area. And of course, we can feed it down there. It's got the cattle, got the livestock to do that. And normally we look at 105, 106% as the break even. It wasn't 2 or 3 weeks ago that price ratio was more like 96% or 97. So you could see some wheat demand in that local area coming in and starting to move that more towards a neutral situation. But I guess that's the way markets work. And that when we have an opportunity to buy something at a good value, we tend to see demand come towards it and then tend to take that opportunity away. So we'll see where that goes in coming weeks.
Dan, you mentioned South America and wanting to make a note on their weather and the Black Sea region as well when it comes to their weather also.
Yeah. Overall, if there's an underlying quiet issue happening out in the grain markets, it has to do with dry conditions in parts of Argentina and southern Brazil, and some wet conditions that have delayed harvest of soybeans elsewhere in Brazil in particular. Those delays in soybeans being harvested are also delaying the planting dates for their second crop corn. So that's at issue. We have if you go online and look at the weather maps that we put together for our KSU Ag Today market information on the Ag Manager website, you can see, gosh, it's pretty dry in parts of Brazil and Argentina. And we're not talking about La Nina very much here, but analysts down in that area are really talking about, or I guess putting the blame for what's occurring on the remnants of La Nina. So we'll see. We're supposedly in kind of a neutral or weaker La Nina, and not a lot of talk about how that could affect the U.S., but it's still having an impact down South America. And in the Black Sea region, you get conflicting reports out of Russia, which isn't surprising with regard to the grain markets. But on the one hand, I've seen an credible article talking about how Russia may lose world leadership in wheat exports, and that grain exports are to drop 20% in 24-25 due to bad weather. Then in the next breath, almost on the next day, you see, gosh, more than 80% of the wheat is good to excellent. Well, it's hard to really pull this apart in terms of what's being said, but it might be framing, positioning in the markets, and a difference of opinions. But either way, there's enough, quote, smoke there that problems in that part of the world are at play to probably help give us some of this price increase that we've seen in the wheat market. And again, we had a week for hard red winter wheat. We mentioned that a little bit earlier. 6 million bushels of shipments. We need about 5.1 million to meet the USDA's projection. And this is about the first week in a good long time, in months, that we've actually had such a strong week of hard red winter wheat movement, actual shipments. So for hard red right now, we've got here we're 34 weeks into this market year, about 65% of the way, and we actually have shipments and sales at about 74% of the way to this 210 million bushel goal the USDA set. So we've been bemoaning the hard red winter wheat market in the United States and in Kansas in particular for a good long time. And now, I guess if you wait long enough, that again, international conditions come into play and start to bring buyers back to the U.S. And again, the issue with the U.S. is that we can store wheat. We can finance the storage. We can ship it better than many other countries. We're not under the gun or under pressure to have to sell it quick to generate cash. So we can hold this at interest cost. And when these other places that do have to have quick force sales start to run out of supplies, then here's the United States. It's a matter of, though, if being patient enough or being forced to be patient enough to wait for the situation every 1 or 2 or 3 years where we end up in our residual storage storer status and can take advantage of it. So we'll see where it goes in coming weeks and months. But right now it looks like things are turning a bit towards the U.S.'s favor on wheat exports. Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again and give us our grain market update. Thank you so much, Shelby. I appreciate it. That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about lice with K-State Extension Beef Veterinarian AJ Tarpoff. AJ, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
AJ, why are we talking about lice?
Oh, lice. Often people, know a little bit about lice. They've heard about it from, school kids, something along those lines. But lice, it's a livestock issue. It's a cattle issue, and it's a winter issue. Lice are very, very common. They're in a lot of different livestock populations, but I think I should start off with they are species specific. So if your cattle have lice or your horse has lice or or if a person has lice, they're not going to intermix. Those lice they're different species. They're not going to cause issues. So if your cattle have lice, your kids can still go to school. So I think that's important to understand. But lice are a winter issue. Their life cycle, they kind of jumpstart during the winter. In the cooler winter months, that's when they begin their reproductive cycles. That's when they start causing issues, and they feed on the outside of skin, and they are very, very itchy. So that's what we see with our cattle is they get extremely, extremely itchy.
What are the different types of lice?
So there are several different species of lice here in North America that impact cattle. But the two main groups that I like to break it into is we have biting lice and sucking lice. The biting lice, they feed exclusively on the outside of cattle. They feed on the secretions of the skin, the oils and things like that coming out of the hair follicles. So they feed just they spend their whole lives feeding on the outside of the hide. Now that sucking louse, what they do is they have a piercing mouth part that actually pierces the hide, and they suck blood. So while one, feeds on the outside, one actually pierces the hide and feeds on the blood of cattle. Those are kind of the two main groups of lice, and we can have both species impacting an animal at the same time. But we can actually look at it just with a little magnifying glass, and we can tell which ones they are, which is kind of interesting.
How do you tell them apart?
Actually, by that mouthpiece. One is a very blunted mouth part around the head, and one is more directed and has a longer, where that piercing mechanism is to suck blood, where you can distinguish between kind of the biting and the sucking louse.
Is it just peering into the skin or the hair and seeing if there's something there?
Yeah, we go at the usually it's they get one of the clinical signs of lice is they start to lose their hair. So we'll see cattle with patchy areas all over the body. Usually we see it around the neck, up over the sides, where we see this patchiness. You can actually take a piece of Scotch tape, the clear tape, and go up and touch the kind of where the patches are, but kind of that line between hairless and hair. You can kind of use the Scotch tape and you can see it on there, which is kind of gross, so to speak. And not that producers need to go do that. That's purely for your information.
What other impact could they have on cattle besides just losing their hair? Yeah,
so losing their hair, I mentioned, it's very itchy. I think one of the thing we don't talk about as much. Yes, it's itchy. Yes, it has a direct impact on the animals. It causes the patchy hair loss. Cattle start to rub. They will rub up against anything and everything. Those of you that see the big chunks of hair on fences, on barbed wire, those are lousy cattle, not lousy, lousy, but so they're louse infested. They will rub up against, they will destroy fences. They will rub up against fence posts. They will anything and every water tanks, you name it, they will rub up against it. So they cause a lot of equipment and a lot of facility damage whenever they get lice because it's so itchy. And then when we think about the overall, production losses, yes, they can lose a quarter pound per head per day, average daily gain loss. When those animals are heavily infested. We can also cause damage to hides. So when we look at feedlot cattle, we can reduce the value of the hides and things like that from some of the damage and from some of the itching just due to the scarring and things like that. Because once they get itchy, they will get to rubbing on anything that they can truly damage themselves. So all of these, we have a true impact, performance impact, well-being impact. We try to control this to the best of our ability.
How does one maybe go about controlling it?
Whenever thankfully, we've got some wonderful insecticides. We have insecticides as well, some of the things that we use for deworming. Most commonly with a lot of producers, when they bring cattle in, after the summer grazing, they may deworm them with some type of insecticide. That would be some of the avermectin classes, so either they're pour-ons or injectable, which is great. Now, understanding that whenever we pull cattle off a pasture in the summer and we may give some of those products, the lice life cycle has not begun yet to be able to get in that reproductive cycle, so they're still dormant. We can have those actually survive when they don't become active until December, January, February, when we start seeing some of those issues. So even though you might have used an insecticide earlier in the fall, doesn't mean you can't have either reinfection or recent exposure and still have lice issues later in the winter. So yes, those dewormers work, but usually we've used them much earlier in the season. More commonly, we have a targeted approach where we use some of our insecticide products that are topical, where we're actually going to give these topical products to get good full coverage on those animals. These would be similar to some of our fly control products. They're labeled for lice as well. Many of them are spot on, where we'll give them from the back of the pole of the head all the way to the tail head. And these don't work they're not systemic. They don't get absorbed into the body, but they activate by touch. So that chemical comes in contact with the lice, which they live on the animals and they spread from animal to animal. They don't live very well in the environment. They live on animals. So we have to treat everybody. If we're going to use those products, we need to make sure we read the label thoroughly. Some of them call for a retreatment in 14 days. The reason for that is those products, many of them kill the adults, but they don't kill the immature stages. That they have this thick glue-like substance we call nits that are on the hair shaft. A lot of those chemical products don't kill the immature stages. So in 14 days, when they hatch out and they become an adult, we may have to treat them again. There are some newer products that are out there that are labeled for one treatment only. Either they maintain a high enough level for a long enough period of time, they still get those that rehatch, or they have some type of insect growth regulator incorporated into it so they don't become adults. So those are very common, but some tips for treatment: don't forget animals. one animal can reinfest the entire herd. I think that's number one is, we can't forget animals. If you have new introductions to the herd, make sure they are treated. So if you bring in just one cow or, mixed groups together, anything like that, you can reinfest the entire group. Number two is realistic expectation is those products, when we treat for lice, they're not going to regrow the hair immediately. So they'll still have patchy hair loss and things like that. It takes a little while for that to regrow. And then I guess lastly, if you have used one of those insecticide products, like either the injectable or pour-on ivermectin, if you used injectable, they do not have efficacy against the biting louse. So the biting lice, because they don't suck the blood, and it's a systemic product, they just don't have any impact against them. Only the sucking lice. So that way, so if you're truly going after lice, some of our more topical products have higher efficacy because they're coming in direct contact with them.
So a great conversation to have with your local veterinarian.
Always, always, always. So contact your veterinarian. They'll be able to walk you through some of the product choice, some of the product selection, and give you some tips on making sure that you get full coverage, adequate supply, making sure we can get those animals treated and well on the stage of recovery so we don't have all that damage, production loss, and damage to our facilities.
So since the lice like colder weather, once it gets warmer, does the issue just kind of go away?
Thankfully, yes. So once we get into the spring months, once the temperatures start to rise, it interferes with their reproductive cycles that they go back to dormancy. So this is truly kind of a winter issue, a confinement issue. We have animals closer together. It's more apt for those animals to transmit these lice from one animal to another because they live their whole life cycle kind of on animals, and it spreads by direct contact. So yes, it's a winter issue. So we're between now and say April, May is when we're going to see the majority of our lice issues.
AJ, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You're welcome.
That was K-State Extension beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff talking about lice control in cattle. If you'd like to read more on this topic, one way you can do that is by checking out a Beef Tips article titled Have a Plan for Lice Control This Winter. You can find it for yourself by going to ksubeef.org and selecting Beef Tips Newsletter. Again, that is ksubeef.org. Or I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. I would like to remind you that while you're on the KSU Beef website, you can look at upcoming events. Just a couple that are happening soon. February 13th is a heifer replacement meeting in Ottawa, Kansas. February 17th, a Northwest Kansas Cow-Calf Clinic in Bird City. And February 19th, a heifer management meeting happening in Effingham, Kansas. There will also be a heifer replacement program happening February 20th in Yates Center. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we end our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, we've seen a little bit of warmer temperatures this past week.
Yeah, we have. It's been enough to work on the snowpack that we've got in the Northeast, gradually melting away. And notice that the snowpack, you can tell it's getting less because temperatures are able to get warmer. We saw temperatures in the 50s in central and eastern Kansas. In the west, they saw 60 degrees this week. So definitely warmer than normal by about 10 degrees or so. And a good reprieve from the cold weather we saw just a few weeks ago.
Did we see some precipitation this week as well?
Yeah, we had a storm system that started coming through Wednesday night with some light rain across portions of southern Kansas, and then that moved north overnight into Thursday morning. Widespread, 1/100 of an inch trace. Some localized areas got about 1/4 inch, and there was some thunder and lightning in there too. So not something we've seen recently. And then overnight into Friday morning, we had a pocket of heavier rain that developed in northeast Kansas as well.
Even though we're seeing some precipitation, any concern for fire?
Yeah, so we did see a little bit of moisture. That wasn't enough really to do a whole lot, especially for western Kansas. They've been drying out over the last really month and a half. And The result has been the vegetation is slowly drying out, becoming more receptive for fire. And we have seen an increase in fire activity. We caught one actually on our camera here the other day on one of our weather stations of a wildfire. And there's a lot of grass, especially southwest Kansas, a lot of tall grass out there. And so despite not really seeing critical fire weather, we're seeing an increase in fire behavior that's being driven by the fuel and by the amount of grass that we have. So as you start to distance ourselves further and further from a wetting rain for folks, especially in southwest Kansas, our concern for fire activity increases, especially as you start going into our grass fire season. And we're coming out of our driest time of the year, but we're still close enough to it. We don't average much precipitation. So definitely something to be mindful about, especially as the forecast, we get into the weekend, we start to see temperatures getting into the 70-degree mark for southwest Kansas. Maybe even a little bit higher than that. And that'll lead to lower humidity and definitely more conducive conditions for fire spread, although we don't really see any big highlights right now for fire weather, just because humidity is somewhat moderated in the mid 20% range and winds aren't overly strong. We've been pretty lucky with the wind. We haven't had big wind events. We've got a very tight temperature gradient across the United States right now. Southern United States is very warm. Northern United States is very cold. And in between that, we have a jet stream that's very strong as a result of that temperature difference. And Kansas kind of finds itself in that middle ground. So we're going to see that jet stream shift north this weekend with those warmer temperatures bouncing up. But then it's going to ebb a little bit and into the middle of next week. We will have an increase in that wind with a weak system on Monday into Tuesday, and then another weak system on Friday into Saturday. Those systems will bring that jet stream further south. They'll bring us cooler air, so we'll moderate our temperatures into the more seasonal mid-40s to mid-20s by the middle of next week. And then we look at the end of next week for the potential for maybe a little bit of that really cold air that's in the northern U.S., to reach this region with maybe some highs in the 30s to 20s. Not talking significant cold by any means, but we are watching to our north and west as they continue to get snowfall. It's a very active pattern for them with that cold air. That might be something we need to keep an eye on as we move into the spring.
What is our normal temperature for right now, Chip?
Normal temperatures right now vary by location. Our extremes, our records are in the 80s and still in the negative 10s. And so our average temperatures for highs, somewhere in the mid-40s. As you get further south and west, a little bit higher. As you get further north and east, a little bit lower. And then our overnight lows, again, vary, especially with the lower terrain. They can get pretty cold. But we should see temperatures around that 20-degree mark for overnight lows. As you get further south, a little bit warmer, and north, a little bit cooler.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.